As is the custom, again, this is the 20th anniversary memorial for Yedida Calvin Stillman. I'd like to say a few words about her. Some of her books and some of her publications, some photos are over here on the table. Maybe if you haven't had a chance to look at them before the lecture tonight, you will afterwards. Yedida Calvin Stillman was a beloved teacher, a world-renowned scholar who died in February 1998. She was born in Morocco and raised in Israel, and she and Norman, or Noam, Stillman worked together for many years at Binghamton University in New York, and together they founded the Judaic Studies program here in 1995. Yedida authored several important studies in her field. I think most famously Arab headdress from the birth of Islam to modern times. Her works are still being read, still being cited, and even still being published, thanks to Noam Stillman's efforts. Noam and Dina Stillman live in Jerusalem. Noam still actively represents the Stillman Center and the University of Oklahoma, as many of our Emirati do at conferences in Israel and internationally. And if you, again, take a look at her work, I might add that in addition to being a path-breaking scholar, great mentor, Yedida was also a devoted wife and mother. Zichronam livracha, may her memory be a blessing. And I bring you best wishes from the Stillman family, who are in Jerusalem, Atlanta, Dallas, and Chicago, and yet other places. Tonight's 20th anniversary Yedida Calvin Stillman Memorial Lecturer is Professor Pamela Nadell, the author of America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, published in 2019 by W.W. Norton. Professor Nadell holds the Patrick Clemens Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University in Washington, D.C. She's the recipient of the university's highest faculty award, Scholar Teacher of the Year. Her other books, Diane, there are in fact quite a few other books and articles, include, but do not exhaust, the list, Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of the Women's Ordination, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Past president of the Association of Jewish Studies, Pamela has also received the American Jewish Historical Society's Friedman Award for Distinguished Service to the Profession. This book, in between the time we invited her and now, has won the National Jewish Book Award, which is a very big deal. And I might say that America's Jewish Women has become a smash hit. Pamela told me last night she's going to hit 50 book talks in the course of the first year or two of its publication, and it is going into paperback immediately, which those of you who are professors and write books know that does not happen automatically or quickly. And of course, when you hit a home run in academia like baseball, it is not an accident. Since her PhD at the definite article Ohio State University, she quickly emerged in her field and has stayed on the cutting edge of it. Professor Nadell is an award-winning teacher, beloved mentor, really a leader nationally in the field, and now she has written a spectacular book, which, at least in her mind's eye, was begun a few decades ago. And it's my great honor to welcome Dr. Pamela Nadell.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Got it. And I'm going to get this.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
So first of all, I really want to thank the Stillman Center for Judaic Studies for bringing me. Professor Alan Levinson, what he didn't tell you is that we have something in common besides the fact that we both do Jewish studies. We studied under the same PhD director, and I especially want to thank the Women's and Gender Studies program also for this incredible, incredible opportunity. I'm going to do something that's a little unusual in opening a talk in a university. I'm going to show you some family photos. This one is my great-grandmother, and I know that it was taken in the first decade of the 20th century, and if you look very closely at her hairline, you can see that she's wearing a wig. I don't know if you can see that all the way in the back. So religiously observant Jewish women, when they get married, will cover their hair so only their husband will see it, and they will wear a wig. And that was in the first decade of the 20th century, and that is also in the second decade of the 21st century. Some, not all, but some observant Jewish women will do this. So I always said that when I looked at this, I knew she was really old-fashioned because in the 19-teens or so, she shouldn't have been wearing, or early 1900s, she shouldn't have been still wearing a wig. And when I was giving a book talk at the University of Minnesota, I saw one of my former undergraduates who's getting a PhD in apparel design. I didn't know there was such a thing. She works in museums, and so she read for me the dress. The dress my great-grandmother is wearing went out of style in 1870. So I knew that I was right. And then this one, taken at the same time, is my grandmother, her daughter. And I always thought that she was very she because she's got a bow in her hair and she's got bows on her shoes. And the dress that she's wearing was called a linen dress or a lingerie dress. It was in style between 1903 and 1910. So I know that she was very au courant. And in the next photo, the woman with her back to us is in a park on a warm spring day. And it's my mother. She's wearing a white blouse and a black pencil skirt, which is what she told me she always wore. And if you look, it's a little hard to see, but if you look really carefully over her shoulder, there's a baby's bonnet peeking out. That's me. And I don't bring a photo of me because I'm wearing what many female professors wear, although I'm looking at a bunch of them, and a lot of them have it on, a black jacket. So I've got my uniform, but I did bring a photo of my daughter. This is taken when she was about 24, and it's kind of very typical for somebody, just out of undergraduate, and she's wearing a short skirt and she's got on tall boots. And when I said to her, I need a photo of you to open my talk, she said, you can have this one, but you have to tell them the boots are yours. But the other thing about the photo that I like, and I'm going to come back to, is that she's taking a selfie, and technology is going to be important for us this evening. So my question is, what am I doing opening a talk with these family photos? But as the clothing of the women in these various generations in my family changed, I knew that their lives had also been different. My great-grandmother was one of more than 2 million East European Jews who came to the United States in the decades surrounding the turn to the 20th century. My grandmother raised her children in the Great Depression. My mother came of age after World War II, and she had a very typical life for a woman coming of age then. She graduated high school, she had a little bit of college, she was a secretary. When she got married and had children, she stopped working, and then when it was time to go back to work, she first entered the workforce again as a secretary, but then she got a real estate license and actually worked as a realtor into her 80s. I rode the coattails of a revolution I did not make, but it allowed me to drive into my career as a university professor. And my daughter is riding the same coattails of that revolution because that revolution opened the doors to professional school, and it led to her entering medical school. So as I thought about the changes in the lives of the women in my family, I began to ask questions about what was different, going all the way back in terms of American Jewish history. What was different about how women raised their families? What was different about the kinds of work that they did or the kinds of work that they were prohibited from doing? What was different about how they voiced their politics? That seems a particularly apt question this evening. What was different about the games that they played? I wanted to know, when did Mahjong become associated as a Jewish woman's game? And I can tell you the answer is the 1920s. I also was really interested in the transformations in women's lives wrought by technology. So I don't know if you know what's going on in this photo. Anybody know? Yeah, she's doing laundry. So imagine, this is going to be really hard for the students in the class to understand this. But this is what it was like to do laundry in the second decade of the 20th century. This photo is on display at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. And the first thing I can tell you about it is it's clearly a posed photo. First of all, I hope she wouldn't have been holding the baby while she was doing the laundry. Secondly, she's wearing shoes that are much too nice for somebody who's like, you know, doing laundry and a splatter of water all over them. But I want you to think about what it meant to do laundry at the beginning of the 20th century and well before. She's lucky. She's got a tap on the wall. You can see the sink there. So she can fill this enormous tub. Then she's got to heat it on the stovetop, dump the clothing in. Then she's got to get it clean, take it out, rinse it out in the sink, haul it up to the roof. Imagine how heavy that tub of wet clothes is. Haul it up to the roof, hang it out to dry, hope it doesn't rain, then take it down, bring it back downstairs and either iron it or fold it and put it away. I don't know about you, I hate doing laundry, but every time I get depressed about it, this is what I think of. Electric washing machines are not invented until the beginning of the 20th century. So understand what I'm thinking about in terms of the changes in women's lives. But most of all, what did I want to know? Mostly, I wanted to know what it meant to these women to be Jewish women. For those of you, I know a lot of you don't know much about Judaism, you're not coming from a class in Jewish history, so it's very hard to define what Jews are. Sometimes they're seen as a religious group, sometimes they're seen as an ethnic group. There have been times when they've been designated as a racial group. So I want to tell you how I tried to think about Jewish women in kind of three ways in this particular book. On the one hand, there are women who centered Judaism, the faith, at the core of their lives. They would move from Sabbath day to Sabbath day, from Jewish holiday to Jewish holiday. Judaism told them what to cook in their kitchens, where they would shop for the food that they cooked in their kitchens. It would dictate the organizations they belonged to, the people they're in contact with. There's another group of Jewish women, and I like to see them as living within the stream of Jewishness. It's braided into their lives. It's part of their lives. Jewishness would have determined things like how much education they had, because Jewish women were and are disproportionately better educated than other American women. It would have determined who they married. It would have determined the neighborhoods they lived in and the neighborhoods that had restrictive covenants that said they couldn't live there. Then there's a whole third group of Jewish women for whom being a Jew was utterly incidental. They didn't see it as central in their lives, but sometimes they would discover that other people decided it was central in their lives, and we will meet them this evening as well. I like to think of it like this. If you think you can be a little bit Jewish, you think you can be a little bit pregnant. So 2 women are going to take us into my story. The first is Grace Nathan. Grace Nathan was born in New York City. You can see she was born in 1752, and she died in 1831. And if I think about the years of her life, I think of the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, the Constitution, the War of 1812. But when I read her letters, and Professor Duval so kindly transcribed them for me because I couldn't read her handwriting, and Professor Duval is an expert on her handwriting. When I read her letters, what do I see in the letters? She writes about a niece that she's very worried about because she's been spitting up blood for a few weeks. But the doctors aren't so worried because they said her corsets are too tight. Corsets are kind of like tight girdle that they would have pulled with strings to get a really tight, small waist. So the point is, clothing matters. Clothing mattered in my family, clothing mattered in her family. And when I think about Grace Nathan, I see her as a daughter and a sister and a wife and a mother and a grandmother and a widow. And then, I don't know if anybody recognize this photo? It's Emma Lazarus, okay? Emma Lazarus was Grace Nathan's great-granddaughter. Emma Lazarus had a completely different life. She never married. She never had a child, but she wrote her way into American history. In the base of the Statue of Liberty, she wrote a poem welcoming the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to the United States. Actually, her name has been in the news so much in the past couple of years during the immigration crisis that I think people think she's still alive. What is stunning about the two of them is that their lives were determined by being female, by being Americans, and by being Jews. And let me explain what I mean by that. As women, they were constrained by the social times in which they lived, the conventions that dictated what were appropriate roles for women of their particular social and economic class. As Americans, they reveled in the liberties afforded them by the United States. And as Jews, they both celebrated an ancient Jewish tradition. But what is stunning is that even though as women they should not have been permitted to make changes within Judaism, they used the liberties of America to push Judaism in new directions, quietly, but nevertheless as harbingers of the future. Let me explain. Emma Lazarus wrote a poem called In Exile. And in that poem, she imagines her Jewish ancestors who were expelled from Spain in 1492, trudging out of Spain and coming to America, a country that she wrote gave her people the freedom to follow Moses' law. And then she adds, and to think the thoughts Spinoza taught. Spinoza was a 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher who was excommunicated, kicked out of the Jewish community because his ideas were heretical. So in claiming this heretic, she was pushing Judaism in different directions. What's stunning is even Grace Nathan does the same thing. Towards the end of her life, Grace Nathan wrote something called an ethical will. An ethical will is a document that people might write as they age, and it contains their life's lessons, the ones they want to pass on to their children and grandchildren. So in her ethical will, she tells her son that at her death, he should only keep his beard for 7 days. Under Jewish tradition, a man does typically not shave following the death of a parent for a minimum of 30 days. She was changing Jewish tradition. And they are harbingers of the women who will do that across this historical narrative. So I'm going to go back now in time to 35 years after the first Jews come to the New World, to what becomes New Amsterdam. Abigail Levy was born in London. When she was 7 years old, she set sail for the United States. When she was 16, she married Jacob. He was 24. Today, in many states, such a marriage would be illegal. She was too young. But in the colonial days, that was the pattern. A man had to be able to support his wife, and the children that would follow quickly on the marriage. Abigail, within the first year of marriage, gave birth to her son Naphtali, and she ultimately had 9 children. 2 of them died fairly young. And we know about her because when Naphtali was in his late teens, he set sail for London to live with his uncle, Jacob's brother, and there Abigail wrote him a series of letters that he apparently preserved, because that's why we have them. We don't have his letters to her, we have her letters to him. What do they tell us? First of all, they tell us that she was an observant Jewish woman. She actually told him never to eat anything except for bread and butter at his uncle's house, because she didn't trust that her sister-in-law would keep a ritually pure kitchen. We have to assume he didn't follow that, otherwise he would have starved. But then we also see her astonishingly writing that she's so sick and tired of Judaism's idol ceremonies and useless superstitions that if, and quote, a Calvin or a Luther would rise amongst us, I would be the first of their followers. So imagine, here is this observant Jewish woman yearning for a John Calvin or a Martin Luther, a figure who creates the Protestant Reformation, calling for the reform of Judaism. And this is well before we have inklings about Reform Judaism in the 19th century. She also learned the price of those impulses because her daughter Phila intermarried with a Protestant named Oliver Delancey, hid the marriage from her mother for 6 months, and when Abigail discovered that her daughter had married out of the faith, Abigail wrote that she was so depressed that she never wanted to see or speak to anyone again. And we actually don't know if she ever reconciled with Phila. I'm going to leave behind Abigail's colonial world. We're going to go past Grace Nathan's early republic, and we're going to skip over the untimely death of Emma Lazarus to meet this woman, Rosa Sonnenschein. In the 1860s, Rosa Sonnenschein came to America from Moravia, from Central Europe. Her husband was a rabbi. They settled in St. Louis, and he was the rabbi there, and she did what a good rabbi's wife should do. So the first thing she did was give birth to the 4th of her 4 children. Families are getting smaller. Second thing that she did was she began writing articles in the Jewish press. Third thing that she did, which I find utterly astonishing, in 1879, she founded the first Jewish women's book club in America, and it is still meeting today. They used parliamentary procedures, which they kept their minutes, and so they would have motions made. So one of the motions in the early years of the club was, there was a motion made to fine any members who came more than 5 minutes late to the meeting. They were going to get fined 10 cents for being late, and that motion passed. And then the other motion that I remember was there was a motion made to do away with the coffee at the intermission, and that motion failed. They wanted their coffee. But she was scandalous in another way, because in 1892 she walked out on her husband. In the 19th century, if you wanted to get divorced, you needed grounds to get divorced. She walked out on him. She gave him grounds to divorce her. Now she's stuck. He's not going to pay her alimony because he divorced her. And so she's got to earn a living. And she does that initially by founding the first English language Jewish women's magazine in the United States. And she calls it the American Jewess. Jewess today is a term that's generally not used positively, but in the 19th century, that's what Jewish women called themselves. That's what Gentiles called Jewish women. And the magazine also shows her advancing change within Jewish tradition. So let me give you 2 examples. First, she features a woman in the magazine whose name was Ray Frank. Ray Frank was a proto-rabbi, religious leader of the Jewish community. She was called by the press of the West, where she was doing her preaching, she was called the Girl Rabbi of the Golden West. She also begins to feature Zionism. In the 1890s, Americans have no interest in Zionism, the movement to build up a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1897, a man named Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Rosa Sonnenschein was one of about only 5 Americans who went to the Congress. She got there, she saw that there was no representative of the American press reporting on the Congress, so she declared herself the sole representative of the press of the United States at the first Zionist Congress, and then she came home and wrote about Zionism. Zionism would become a powerful movement in American Judaism and continues down until this day. She was a harbinger of that, really in a stunning way. In the magazine, she also began featuring the first of what I like to call the powerhouse Jewish women's organizations. In 1893, the National Council of Jewish Women was born. Its founding president was Hannah Solomon. These organizations, and there's a relatively small period when they all emerged, gave Jewish women avenues for activism that they did not have because they were not about to join the other powerhouse women's organizations of those years, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. As Rosa Sonnenschein said about the Women's Christian Temperance Union when it tried to enlist Catholic and Jewish women, its name is a little narrow. So they don't join that, but they're looking for ways to give back to the world and to their people. And my question was, why? Because the organizations that emerged, we have National Council of Jewish Women in 1893. In 1912, Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization, emerges. And then a couple of years later, the big synagogue sisterhood organizations emerge. Synagogues, Jewish congregations have women's groups inside them. They're called sisterhoods, and national associations of those groups emerge. And all these organizations are alive 100 years later. So I want to know what's going on that allowed this to happen. And I think it's a reflection of structural changes in the lives of American women. In 1800, the average white woman in America, and Jewish women would have been counted in this, average white woman in America had 7 children. By 1900, she has 3.5. I don't know what to do with the 0.5, so I've never been able to figure it out. In 1850, life expectancy for a white woman in the United States was less than 40 years. By 1927, it is stretched to 57 years. These women were living longer, they were having fewer children, they were looking for ways to fill their lives with meaningful activity, and they were middle class and they were not going to go into the workforce. And so they create these powerhouse organizations and they take up very important causes. Here, the National Council of Jewish Women is massed at the White House in 1926 because they were fighting against what was called white slavery, international networks of traffickers who would lure young women and girls traveling on their own in this great era of migration, would lure them into false marriages or kidnap them or worse, and rape them, and then send them to brothels in Istanbul and Buenos Aires. Hadassah, the other group that I mentioned a minute ago, Hadassah in 1913 sent 2 nurses to Jerusalem. They hung out a sign that said Nurses Settlement, Hadassah, Daughters of Zion. In 1 year, they saw 5,000 patients. These become very important avenues in the lives of America's Jewish women. But America's Jewish women didn't always need a powerhouse organization to become an activist. In 1902, on the Lower East Side of New York, when the price of kosher meat, this is the meat that Jewish women were cooking in their homes, it's the meat that's approved for them to use. when that price soared from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound, poor immigrant Jewish women of the generation of my great-grandmother broke into butcher shops, smashed the windows, took the meat, threw it out on the street, doused it with kerosene, and sometimes set it aflame. They didn't want anybody else eating it. And they launched the first of a series of food and rent strikes that would erupt among Jewish women in New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore. I'm not sure about Oklahoma City or Norman. But whenever their ability to feed their families was threatened, as one of the 100 women who were arrested in the 1902 kosher meat boycott told the judge, she said to him, "We're not rioting, only see how thin our children are." So they were standing up for their children and their ability to feed their families. But sometimes Jewish women stood up all alone as individuals. Most of the students here will never have heard of Edna Ferber, but some of those who are my age will know that she was a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. She wrote a book and then became a play and a movie, Showboat and also Giant. Edna Ferber describes a dinner that she went to shortly after Adolf Hitler came to power in Nazi Germany in 1933. It was somewhere in Michigan, and everybody who was invited, it's like an intellectual soiree. Everyone who was invited has to stay overnight because of the long distance at this industrialist's home. And they're at dinner, and he starts talking about money-grubbing Jews controlling the world. And she watched as everyone at that dinner table began agreeing with their host. And she stood up and said, "I am a Jew." They didn't know it. She's one of those women who hid her Jewish identity. And she was so horrified by the hate that she saw on their faces that when she went to her room that night, not only did she lock the door, she put a chair against it. She was not the only Jewish woman to write about standing up to anti-Semitism. In this magazine, published briefly in New York in the 1940s, this issue is from November 1942, an anonymous Jewish woman writes an article called "I Am a Jewess." And what's stunning about that article is that she describes her experiences with anti-Semitism that are filtered through her children, and her relatives. So let me explain what I mean. Her son is in college. He wants to be a chemist. There's no point in him getting a degree in chemistry because that industry in the 1940s does not hire Jews. So his second choice actually is to go to medical school if he can get in, because there are quotas against Jews in medical school. But then even if he goes to medical school, when he gets out, the only place that he's going to be able to find a residency is at a Jewish hospital, because she knows from one of her cousins who's a nurse that the cousin has to travel an hour every day to a Jewish hospital so that she could practice nursing, even though there's a hospital right in her neighborhood on Long Island. And then another cousin wants to join the Red Cross, but when she goes to the meeting, this is World War II, they need women in the Red Cross. When she goes to the meeting of the Red Cross, she discovers that all of the tasks have been allocated to others. And then she says, it can happen here too. And what she's doing is she's looking across the ocean, because November 1942 is the month that Americans are told about the Holocaust, about the murder of European Jewry. But I remain interested in what's going on in the home. Kate Simon was a wonderful travel writer and also a memoirist. And in this book, Bronx Primitive, she writes about Friday nights growing up in her home. The Jewish Sabbath starts on Friday evening. It runs through Saturday. So on Friday during the day, her mother would get ready for the Sabbath. So she would do two things. She would polish the furniture with lemon oil, and she would make gefilte fish. Gefilte fish is a dish made of chopped up fish, and when you cook it in the house is going to smell of the fish that's cooking. And then as the Sabbath would approach, Friday evening, she would cover her hair. She didn't wear a wig, but she would cover her hair as would be appropriate for a married Jewish woman. She would light 2 candles, the Sabbath candles, and she would begin to say a blessing over those candles. One Sabbath Eve, in the middle of that prayer, her mother tore off the headcloth, blew out the candles, stopped the blessing, and turned to her astonished family and said, "No more. Never again. I have never believed in it, and I don't have to do it because my mother's not here to make me." And according to Kate Simon, her mother never again lit Sabbath candles, but the house still smelled of lemon oil and gefilte fish on Friday evenings. And so it's another example of Jewish women transforming the traditions. So when I get to the years after World War II, the examples of women in activism just kind of rush forward. So I want to give you a couple of headlines, okay? Bronx Girl 21 wins Miss America title. Who is it? Bess Meyerson, okay? She was it was 1945. She was the only Jewish woman ever to have been Miss America. And Miss America is not a big deal so much today. It was a very big deal back then. Boxing fan wins $64,000 decision. Who is it? Anybody? Dr. Joyce Brothers. So Dr. Joyce Brothers was eventually became a television personality and a radio personality, but in the late 1940s, early 1950s, she was a very unusual Jewish woman. She had a PhD in psychology. She wants to stay home with her only child, but she's married to a physician, and they can't make it on one salary because he's a resident and he doesn't make enough money. So either he turns to her or she turns to him and says, "You know, you're really smart. Why don't you memorize a boxing encyclopedia and go on one of those newfangled 1950s TV shows?" It was called the $64,000 question. So she goes on the show, memorizes the encyclopedia, goes on the show. She won not $64,000, but $128,000 because she won twice. Okay, next headline, Case of the Teenage Doll. Students should know this one. Who's the teenage doll? It's Barbie, right? It's got to be Barbie. So Barbie was created by Ruth Handler of Mattel. By the way, Ruth Handler had 2 children. Their names, Barbara and Ken. This one is not a headline, but a song. There was a song called "Will You Love Me Tomorrow?" It was Carole King, who used to be Carol Klein, and Jerry Goffin wrote the song. This is their wedding day. They're getting married because she's pregnant. What happens to women who find themselves on the family way in the 1950s? They've got 3 choices. She could try to have an illegal abortion, which was very dangerous, not only for her health, but also abortionists routinely got sent to jail. She could go away and have the baby and give the baby up for adoption. It was much more common for Catholic women, although I have some cases of Jewish women who did it. Or she could marry the father or someone else who was willing to marry her. And then my last example from this immediate post-war period, Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique. All of them are Jewish women. All of them are distinctively different Jewish women. And their names in the news belie this image. This image comes from the National Museum of American Jewish History. I like to think of it as the mothers of the baby boom, pushing the baby boomers into the future. I look at those carriages. The little girls in those carriages would grow up to make the revolution, whose coattails I rode. And some of their mothers would also play powerful roles in that revolution, because women who are pushing baby carriages have an awful lot of time to think. So I want to show you with 3 more examples of how complicated Jewish women's lives were in the 1950s. and I'll start with this one. Luba Bott. Luba Bott was born in Poland, survived World War II, and a chance meeting with her uncle, Sidney Hillman, after the war. Sidney Hillman was a very important labor leader in the United States, let her come to America after the war. In Poland, she had been a nurse, but after the war, because didn't have her school records, she could only be a nurse's aide. Astonishingly, her records from her Warsaw nursing school actually survived the war, were brought over to the United States, translated, she learned English, she passed the nursing licensing exam, and she became a nurse in the United States. 2 weeks after she got here, one of her aunts said to her, "I want you to tell me everything that happened to you during the war, and then I don't want you ever to speak of it again." So Luba Bott told her. Luba Bott told her how she was living starving in the Lemberg ghetto in Poland. How one morning she ran to the hospital where her husband had been confined as a patient, and he had disappeared along with all the patients who had been deported the night before. How she survived the liquidation of the Lemberg ghetto by hiding in a bunker. How she was captured by the Gestapo and whipped because they wanted her to confess that she was a Jewish woman. How she refused to confess, and instead they sent her to Auschwitz, but not as a Jew, but as a Polish political prisoner, and then how somehow she survived Auschwitz. Her story, I don't know if she ever spoke of it again, but she wrote 2 volumes of an unpublished memoir, which I found in the archives and included here. She was one of 140,000 Jews who came after World War II to America and who rebuilt their lives. But even as they rebuilt their lives, the memory of everything they had gone through hovered over their lives all their days, and also over the lives of their children and their grandchildren. Another different Jewish woman from these years, Ethel Rosenberg. The execution for spying for Soviet Russia, the execution of the Rosenbergs for those activities sent a Cold War chill across the Jews who had long embraced the politics of the left. And finally, Jerry Fair left her husband and children in the late 1940s and went to hang out in the subterranean lesbian clubs of Greenwich Village. We tend to think of the LGBTQ movement as starting only in the late 1960s, but her story and others prove that there's a much longer history for lesbian Jewish women. So as we start to move out of the 50s and into the 60s, this is the image that I like to think of. TV dinners. They were invented in 1953. They were supposed to make women's lives easier. Remember my point about technology. But of course, what changes women's lives? The invention of the birth control pill. For the first time, women have a secure way of controlling their family planning. So when I think of the 60s, these are the images so often we see. I don't know if any of you are taking any courses on the 60s, but the Vietnam War, the Beatles, the Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Woodstock, Mao Zedong, the Stonewall Inn, and the moon landing. But when I think of the 60s in terms of American women, this is the image. Women on the march creating the feminist revolution. We've already spoken about Betty Friedan. I want to talk about 2 more women who were Jewish women in the forefront of the feminist revolution. I can't talk about all of the women who were leaders in that movement. It's actually quite stunning. So the first had escaped Nazi Germany in the 1930s, come to America. Her name was Sonia Pressman. In the United States, she became a lawyer. Every time she would go on a job interview, the lawyers, the men, they would say to her, "You can be my legal secretary." She didn't want to do that. So in 1964, she got hired by something called the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. It was a government body established to hear cases that were coming forward under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination based on race or sex in employment. She gets to the commission. 2/3 of the cases are about racial discrimination. 1/3 are about sex discrimination. But the lawyers choosing which cases to hear are not taking any of the cases about sex discrimination. So she turned to Betty Friedan, said, American women need a civil rights organization to fight this. They created the National Organization for Women. 12% of its founding members were Jewish women at a time when Jews made up about 3% of the population of the United States. Another immigrant, this one who fled Vienna in 1938, 1939, her name was Gerda Lerner. She came to the United States. When she was in her 40s, she got a PhD at Columbia University for a dissertation on American women. She almost single-handedly pioneered the creation of the writing of women's history. In the early 1970s, she began petitioning her adopted country to create a Women's History Week. Now, we are in, tonight, fittingly, Women's History Month. I can't even begin to talk about how feminism changed the Jewish community, so I'll use 2 photos. This is what the traditional world of Judaism looked like in the 19th and the early 20th century. These are women at their confirmation. The rabbi is sitting in the center, and they've been studying with him. This is the confirmation class of 1946 at a synagogue in Brooklyn. Anybody recognize anybody in the photo? Yeah? Ruth Bader Ginsburg is sitting to the left of the rabbi. I like to say this is at her confirmation, not at her confirmation hearings. And this is how much feminism changed Judaism, to see Jewish women leading prayer and actually also wearing male ritual garb. And you can ask me more about that. So just think about all we did. In a relatively short period of time, we have covered this enormous swath of history. We have looked at Jewish women like Abigail Levy Franks, who centered Judaism at the core of their lives, but also who yearned for change. We have looked at women for whom Jewishness was really important, like the women of the National Council of Jewish Women. And we've also met women like Edna Ferber, who essentially didn't see being Jewish very important at all, but others saw it as very important in their lives. I want to close with a story about a pair of 2 other letter writers. At the end of the 20th century, in the 1970s, 1980s, there was a movement in the United States to help free Soviet Jews, to let, as the phrase back then went, it said, "Let my people go." It's a phrase from the Bible, to let the Soviet Jews who were clamoring to get out of the Soviet Union, where they were not allowed to practice their religion, to let them come out. In the United States, American Jews, when their sons and daughters would have their coming-of-age ceremony, it's called a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, they would have, when they were 13, they'd have a coming-of-age ceremony in the synagogue, and they were being matched up with a Jewish teenager in the Soviet Union who couldn't have a coming-of-age ceremony. So I found a letter in the archive, and this teenager from North Miami Beach in 1982 writes to her twin in the Soviet Union, they were called twins, and she says to her, "Did you get the letters that I sent you?" So I decided I would go find the twin. Where did I go? Like a good historian, I went on Facebook. I found the twin in Jerusalem. She had gotten out of the Soviet Union. Her name is Kira Vovolsky. She became a web designer. So I said, did you ever get those letters? And she said she didn't remember if she ever got these particular letters. So I said, well, by any chance, are you and your twin, are you Facebook friends? And she said, no, she and Sheryl Sandberg, who is the COO of Facebook, are not Facebook friends, but she said that her father and Sandberg's mother are. And it's a great place to end this like huge sweep of Jewish history and of America's Jewish women, because it's with the letter writers of the most recent generation, and they will lead us into the next chapter of this story. So thank you.